My name is Margie. Today we're going to make this mid-century modern chair. All the material lists and pattern sheets are going to be available for you as PDF downloads at the bottom of the video. Hope you enjoy. Let's get started. I start by finding as many pictures as I can from as many different angles as I can. Pretty easy with this style because it's fairly popular and it's not hard to find images, especially if they're doing reproductions, and then you can just go to a sales site. Then I find an image with the measurements. Sometimes they're better than others. This one wasn't too bad. And from there I proceed to make a pattern. This pattern will be available to you as a PDF download at the end of the video. For this project, I'm using 1/16 inch basswood. I'm going to be cutting 2 seats and 2 backs. We're going to transfer our paper pattern onto the wood. Remember, we're making 2 of each, 2 of the seat and 2 of the back. We'll be using a sharp X-Acto knife to cut the pieces out after we trace them on. Oh, but wait, we didn't check the grain of the wood, and that's super important. So the grain of the wood determines which way it bends, because we have to bend this wood to give it a nice curve. So you want to make sure that you put your pattern piece on in the proper direction. So the way I had it the first time, like so, was not going to bend. It was going to be completely wrong, which I have done before. So we want to turn it so that we get it in the right direction so that we'll be able to bend the chair properly. Once you determine that, then you can trace around it and start to cut. I don't worry too much about the curved lines. I cut all the straights first. We'll worry about the little curved bits after. You can also sand them off with a sanding block. Don't worry too much about the sanding at this stage. You want to be careful, and every step you do makes the next step go easier. There's no doubt about that. But you do have many levels of sanding to go through after this. There's the 4 pieces cut, and they're ready to go in the hot water. You just throw them in. This does not take very long to soften this basswood. Probably a half an hour is all you need. If you need to submerge it, you can put something a little heavy on the top, but I don't find with this wood it's all that necessary. Our wood's been soaking, and we're going to look around the house and find things to bend to get the right curvature for the chair that we're making. I pull them both out together, bend them around this glass. This is where you're going to want to refer back to your original drawing or your original sketches or your original picture and see what the curve looks like. It's not that much of a curve. So this particular glass is going to be too small for this project. So we're going to look for something a little bit bigger. Let's try this one. It might be better. Honestly, it might be a little bit too flat. So I think we should keep looking. The curve does stretch out a little bit, so you can exaggerate it slightly. This looks like it's going to be pretty good to me. It feels right. I'm going to hold it up so you can see it in a minute. And I think from looking at my original picture that that's a pretty good curve. Again, it's going to flatten out slightly because it's going to get wet again when you stain it, when you put polyacrylic on it. So in all those stages it tends to stretch out a bit, but you don't want to exaggerate it too much. So that's perfect for that. I'm going to take an elastic band and I'm going to attach it onto this bottle. And it just so happens that the top is the perfect size for the back of the chair. So there you go. So you really have to let it dry for a good 24 hours. Then you can take the elastics off, remove them from their shape, from their bottle, and we will then glue them together and put them back on the bottle. Once the glue is completely dry, you remove them again from their bottle or form, and now is the sanding. And you can't sand too much. I'm using about an 80 grit sandpaper, and I'm using a sanding block. You don't need to. You can just use sandpaper in your hand. I do want to point out that if you look back to the original picture of the chair, the front part of the chair is rounded. The front edge is rounded while the back edge is not. So you want to keep that in mind. I go all the way around the edge flat first, and then I start to shape the inside of the chair. So to get a nice little rounded edge. Sometimes I'll take the sandpaper off the sanding block and just use it with my finger if the curve is quite small. Now we're going to work on making the legs of the chair. For this, the easiest process is to make a jig, which I'll get into in a minute. I'll just explain that the first chair that I made, I did not use a jig. I used the same process I did for finding a form for the seat in the back. I just went around until I found small boxes or pieces of wood that gave me the curve that I thought was right. But if you want to do more than one chair, making a jig is really the best way to do it. The hardest part about making the jig is making the pattern, and luckily for you, I have done that for you. So this will also be available as a PDF download at the end of the video. To make the jig, you're going to need a scrap of wood, probably about 6 by 6 inches and maybe a half an inch to an inch thick. You're going to need a 1/4 inch drill bit with the drill, and you're going to need a 1/4 inch dowel. A foot would probably be plenty, maybe a bit less. The red dots in this diagram show you where the dowels are going to go. You're going to want to put the paper pattern on the scrap of wood and mark the center of each of the red dots. Then you'll drill with your 1/4 inch drill bit on each of the dots, and then you'll insert about an inch of 1/4 inch doweling into each of the holes. With some wood glue, let it dry really thoroughly before you proceed to the next step. Here's the finished jig. I like to put the measurements right on the jig itself so that when it comes time for me to cut the pieces, I don't have to worry about finding an original pattern. It's just all right there in one place. So you can see I've got the length of the leg marked out. Again, I've done this for you. This is the wet coffee stirrers. What I'm using for the legs are coffee stirrers, not popsicle sticks. Coffee stirrers are a little thinner. And they're soaked for about a day. The longer you soak them, the better. You can boil them, you can steam them. I'm not going to speed up this segment, and it might be long and it might be boring, but why I didn't speed it up is that I want you to see how slowly I'm going to bend the wood. You'll notice that my index finger on my left hand is holding that corner as I bend. Now on the right side, I'm holding it tightly. That helps keep it from, breaking right in half. I always soak extra sticks because you will inevitably break one or two as you're going, and once they snap, and you can feel it happen, once they snap, you just toss it. There's no saving it. Just forget about it and toss it out. So again, you've got to go real slow. Now you may notice some splinters of wood at the curve happening, and that's not a problem. That's not the same as it breaking right in two. As long as it's curved, if there are splinters, if they're not too extreme, you'll be able to cut some of those off and sand them off, and you won't even notice. And you'll see me do that later on in the video. So don't worry about a little bit of splintering, but if it forms a 90-degree angle and you can hear it snap, then you might as well just start another one. The back leg has more extreme curves, so it's going to be the one that's the toughest one, and so start with the top one first. It's a little bit easier, but again, you can see how slowly I'm pulling that up. It's a process that you can't hurry. I usually start the bending process at the top of the dowel pegs, not at the bottom. It just makes it easier, and then you can push them down to the bottom afterwards. And you'll also notice that I'm not worried at all about the lengths here. I'll cut those all off after where I've got them marked. So at the 2 1/4 mark, I'll trim all that. No point in giving yourself extra work at this stage. Do it all at the end. The legs have dried for 24 hours, so now I'm going to remove them from the jig, glue them back together, and clamp them. This is where I'm going to sand off the inside corners that are hidden once I glue them together. You could take a file in there after and sand it, but it's just as easy to sand it beforehand. This is also where if there's any really long splinters that are frays, you can trim them off with a little pair of scissors or an X-Acto knife, and then just sand really well. Again, you'll notice that I'm not at all worried about the length of the legs. That's going to come later. A little glue. And I'm going to be using binder clips for this particular process, but you can also use masking tape. Both work equally as well. If I run out of binder clips, which I do sometimes, then masking tape works fine. Once the glue is dried, and this of course depends on the glue that you've used, you can remove the binder clips and we'll start the process of cutting and trimming the legs to shape. This is where I get my jig out again, and because I've got all my measurements nice and handy, I know that front leg, each of the front legs has to be 1 1/4 inches long. So I'm going to measure that out, give myself a pencil mark. I'm going to mark the center too, and you'll see why in a few minutes. Now I'm going to use these miter shears. If you don't have miter shears, you can use an X-Acto, you can use whatever a little saw. I have the miter shears. You don't need to buy these to do this project with, but they are very handy. So the legs of this chair are actually tapered. See, there I'm cutting off some of the really badly frayed ones, which I'll then sand. Get them nice and smooth. So I'm now going to taper these legs, and that's where that center point helps me. I don't want to go right to the mark because it doesn't come down to a point, but the legs are slightly tapered. Looks like a really tiny amount, but it does make a nice difference, and it's very particular to this style of furniture. So marking that taper, and then this wood is pretty soft too. You can use a utility knife if you want. You can probably just sand. Again, this is a coarse sandpaper. You can also use a power sander, the little power sanders or Dremels. Everybody has a different way of doing it. If you are going to use the utility knife, you want to be careful just to take off little bits at a time. As soon as you if you tried to cut down on the pencil line, you might hit the grain and then you're going to lose it. So if you do use a knife, just use it in really small slivers, like you're whittling, I guess. And then just sand, sand, sand. If you look at any piece of furniture, the edges of the wood is very rarely very sharp. So you want to keep that in mind. So here are my 4 pieces, my 2 assembled legs, sanded, looking pretty good. Back leg. Seat back with the curved edge on the front, but a sharper edge on the back. And the seat itself. So I'm ready to stain. Start with about a half a teaspoon of water in this little cup. I'm using acrylic paint. You can use wood stain, but you've got a lot longer drying time with wood stain, so I prefer just to use acrylic paint. It's easy, you almost always have some around the house. This is just a dark brown, and I'm going to add a little bit of red in with this as well. Another combination that I like a lot is brown with black. And another way that I like to make the chairs is with no stain at all. So you can pick and choose. The stain does yellow it down a little bit. You could also make a really light yellow stain. Just depends on the look that you're going for. Mix it really well, because if there's any little lumps of paint in there, they're going to mark up your wood. And remember, you are staining, you're not painting. So you don't want it too thick. I felt like this was just a tiny bit too thick. I think I added a bit more water. That's just something that you have to get used to, get a feel for. And just paint your pieces. Try and keep them even. If you get an excess of stain on, you can just take a paper towel and wipe off the excess. You probably also will stain this again once it's assembled, so don't worry too much. Get everything covered. So here are the pieces stained, ready to assemble. I'm going to use tacky glue. You can use whatever kind of glue you like, but I like to use the Alien's tacky glue. I'm going to use masking tape as a clamp. You can use clamps if you have some that fit, and I do, but I think I'm using them on something else right now, so the little binder clips aren't quite right. The masking tape works well too. So I'm going to take a little bit of tape, and I am going to eyeball it, actually. If you want to measure. I have pretty good luck just eyeballing it where center things are. But one thing I do is I look at it from all angles. So get it on there, get the tape on, and then have a really good look. Turn it right around, look at it from all different angles. Same thing with the front legs. We'll just eyeball it. They go on right in front of that bottom bracket. And again, masking tape, and just look at it from a bunch of different angles. And then proceed to do the back in the same manner. Okay, glue is dry. I'm going to take off the masking tape. Again, I'm seeing some little spots that I'm going to want to touch up with the stain, but that's fine. You could, I suppose, stain it after this step, but it's a lot harder to get into the little crevices, so I just as soon stain it before and touch it up in the next step. Oh, that tape is being stubborn. So that's looking pretty good. Now is when you want your little tiny drill. If you don't have a drill holder, you can just hold it in your fingers. The wood is so soft. I want to use some small nails and just adhere it just to make it more secure. Now, you don't have to do this, I don't think. I mean, it depends on whether or not, I guess, it's going to be handled very much. And, you know, the nails aren't long. I don't know how much they're going to do, but I just feel a little bit better. And you do see the bolts in the original chair, so I think it gives it a little added look as well. And don't worry about how far you go up through, because the upholstered seat goes on top and will cover all the nail holes. So you don't have to worry about going through the seat. I was going to put 2 holes in this one. In this section, I decided to only put 1. I just didn't have the room, and I didn't think it was necessary. So I put 1 in this bottom, attaching the back leg, attaching to the seat. And I'm going to put 2 in the front leg. I think I'll mark them. Sometimes, again, I just eyeball, but maybe this time I'll mark it. If I really wanted to go crazy, I could measure it, but I think I'll just go by eye. But obviously, if you want to mark it and you feel better measuring it, by all means. So again, tiny drill, and just go right through. So now I'm going to fit my nails, and I usually stick them in first just to make sure there's no issues before I put the glue on. But it's up to you. They do stick up out through the chair, and we'll snip them off after, but we'll just make sure everything's good to go before we insert them. I'm going to scrub off any of the, you know, wood and whatnot that's sticking out just with my finger. And again, don't forget these get covered up. So now I'm just going to put a bit of glue on a whatever, scrap piece of paper, or doesn't matter what. And I'll dip the nails into the glue and then insert the glue, or insert the nail into the nail holes. So we're ready to do the upholstery. For this, I'm going to use cardstock, and I'm going to cut a shape just slightly smaller than the wooden back. I'm going to cut a piece of quilt batting slightly larger, very, very, very small amount, 1/16 of an inch maybe. And then this is a vinyl. It's a textured vinyl. It looks like leather, and I'm going to cut it about maybe 1/4 of an inch bigger all around. I'm going to use a glue gun for this step, but I do use a really tiny glue gun, and I use as little amount of glue as I can. You don't want it all glopping and carrying on all over the place. You could use a tacky glue and clamp each little piece if you want. It takes a little longer. You could use any, you might have a favorite glue that dries really fast. I find this works okay. I just have to be careful not to get too much on there. So do all your 4 sides first. And this vinyl that I'm using is pretty stretchy. So I'm actually pulling it just slightly as I pull in. I don't want to pull it too much because it is just cardstock, so you will sort of totally deform the whole thing if you pull too much. But I am pulling it in slightly. It's going to react differently if you're using fabric, and you don't have to use vinyl. You can use any fabric you want. But again, just ever so slightly, just give it a little stretch as you're pulling in, and then hold it. Then you go to the corners and do the center of the corner first. You might need to do a few of these to get good at it. There's a little knack to it so that you don't get the sort of lumpy corner edges, but get onto it. So now I've just got that one piece. I'll put a little bit of glue in the middle, in that little crevice, and squish it down with my finger. And again, because I'm pushing in a little bit, I'm getting rid of all those little sharp corners. So here's the stained and varnished finished piece. Been assembled, varnished afterwards. There's probably about 5 coats of varnish on this, and I sanded lightly with a very fine sandpaper in between the last few coats, but not the very last coat. It's quite glossy. It's a semi-gloss polyacrylic that I use, but it comes out pretty glossy. And here is the upholstery pieces. I'm going to show you a couple of ways of attaching them. The first way is with binder clips. The second way is with elastics. I'm going to put a scrap piece of fabric over top of the vinyl before I put the binder clips on, just to keep it from marking the top of the vinyl. So I've spread a really thin layer of my tacky glue right to the very edges. And then do the same for the seat. So I've let the glue dry, and I'm ready to take off the clamps or the clips, the elastics, and see how they look. One thing with the elastic method is that you can see if things get off kilter a little bit, whereas with the clipping method, it's a little bit harder to see what's happening underneath. So the elastic method is definitely easier to put on and to take off. I don't think this was the right vinyl for this project. It was new vinyl and I really wanted to try it. It's a little bit thick, so you see how I couldn't get a perfectly smooth edge. So I'll probably redo this with the thinner vinyl at some point. This vinyl is going to be great for some projects like couches or sofas or benches, just not for this one. But I wanted to show you how it came out. So this is it, the final product. I'm pretty pleased. I hope you enjoyed watching. If you have any questions, you can always message me. And thanks for watching. Bye.